Hey there. So today we're going to be talking about academic writing for psychology, and we're going to see just how different writing for our science classes can be from other classes. So, as I said, we're talking about academic writing for psychology. And the first thing we want to keep in mind is that scientific writing is going to be very different than writing you would do for English courses or for other types of courses, for your humanities courses, for example. So some things to note about psychology writing. Psychology writing is typically straightforward. It's usually rather boring. We're not using a lot of adjectives, so it's not really descriptive. It doesn't read like our fiction novels would. And unless the paper asks you to give information about your opinion does not belong in the paper. So it's not about you unless the prompt for the paper tells you to write about your opinions, okay? So what are the things that we don't want to include in our APA writing? We don't include the title of the article we're summarizing. We don't include the author's first names or their initials. So I've had some students that refer to authors by their first names. You don't know these people, so refer to them by their last names only. We don't include the affiliations of the authors. That includes where they work, where they teach, where they do research. We don't include that. And we don't include where we found the article, or that this is our first article or our second article. We don't include things like that. We simply reference the source and summarize the source. So one thing that writing teachers often teach about is transitions. So a lot of students will write things such as, in my second source. We don't do that in psychology. We quite literally just move from source to source. One thing that we may do is use headings for transitions. So I'll finish talking about Article 1, and then I'll insert a small heading that indicates the topic of Article 2, such as, self-perception theory, and then I'll start summarizing Article 2. There's no need for things such as, in the next source I found, or in my second article. We don't do that. So if you're looking at the slide, it says many writing teachers instruct you to use transitions. For example, in the next article we'll be talking about, we do not use them. Again, you can use headers, but you don't include things like that. You simply in-text the reference of the authors and write about their study. So how do we do our referencing within our paper? Every single paragraph has to have at least one reference. And because science writing is about summarizing the research, not your opinion, the only thing we should be summarizing is the research or evidence that you have read. So whenever we paraphrase from a source, remember paraphrasing means summarizing in your own words what the authors wrote about. Now, keep in mind that, taking a sentence from an author, changing two words to different words that you think are synonyms to those words, that is not paraphrasing. It's still actually a form of plagiarism, okay? So what you want to do is think to yourself, so read this article and think to yourself, how would I summarize it if I was talking to a friend? And that's what you want to include in your information. But also keep in mind that you don't want to use slang or things like that in your academic writing because that is not professional. So whenever we paraphrase, we include a reference. And so this also includes if you're using statistics from a source. Obviously, you got that information from somewhere, so you need to reference where you got that information from. Whenever we mention an author, we always include the date of publication, so we always include a reference. And whenever we define a word, we include a reference to where we learned to paraphrase that definition from. It may seem like you may be reading this and thinking that's a lot of referencing. Yeah, science writing includes a lot of referencing because you're summarizing information that you have learned from other sources. So let's talk about parenthetical references or references inside of parentheses. So when we're referencing in our writing, we can use a parenthetical reference, meaning inside parentheses. So for example, social psychology is the scientific study of how people think about others. Here's our parenthetical reference for where I learned that information. Author the ampersand, the other author, comma space, the date of publication. Notice that the closed parentheses is here and the punctuation is here. Okay, so that is a parenthetical reference. You can also do a reference in the actual text of your writing. So we can say Myers and Twenge, 2019, write that social psychology is the scientific study of how people think about others. If a whole paragraph is paraphrasing from one source, then what you can do is you can kind of sandwich this entire paragraph in references. So we would start the paragraph with a reference in the text, then end the paragraph with a parenthetical reference. So if this was an example, so the beginning of the paragraph, Myers and Twenge 2019 summarized, and then we would type the rest of our paragraph. At the end of our paragraph, we would then finish it with open parentheses, author and author, comma space, date of publication, close parentheses, and again, the punctuation goes after the closed parentheses. So this is how we would sandwich an entire paragraph within references to show the reader that this entire paragraph was paraphrased from one source. Now, some students read a source, and within that source, the author that they're reading references someone else. And a lot of students have questions about, if I want to reference that someone else, how would I do that? And this is what we call as referenced in. So we only want to reference sources that we've actually read. So if you want to summarize something you read about in a source you read, it looks a little bit different. So here's an example. So I read Bob, which was published in 2002. Bob, 2002, summarized Leahy, 2018. If I want to summarize what Leahy wrote about, then I would do it this way. So Leahy, 2018, comma space, as cited in Bob, 2020, found that. So what I'm doing here is telling the reader, I'm summarizing Leahy, and I read Leahy in Bob, 2020. So then what goes on your reference list? Bob, 2020, the source that you actually read, goes on your reference list. So Bob, 2020 is the source that goes on my reference list because I read Bob, 2020. Okay. Again, punctuation, it goes at the end of the sentence, and if a parenthetical reference is at the end of the sentence, it goes after the closed parentheses, just like this, and as I've demonstrated on a couple of previous slides. So let's talk about your reference list. It goes on a separate page, so insert a page break before it starts so that your program keeps it on a separate page. It is titled References. It is centered, it is not bold, it's not underlined, and it's not in italics. It is not titled Works Cited. It is simply References. Even if there's only one reference on that list, it is still titled References. The reference list is alphabetical by the first author's last name. It's not numbered. There are no bullet points for each entry. And you may think, well, this is kind of how I want to do it because this is my style. No, this is not your style. This is APA style, write in APA style. The reference list is double spaced, as is the rest of the paper, and your references have a hanging indent. If you don't know what that means, Google it, okay? And it will show you what that is and how to do it. So more about your reference list. If you go in the modules area on Canvas, there is a module called Course Resources, and there are links to how to do your references in APA style there. The sources you should be referencing are journal articles, as we've discussed. So when you're looking at that formatting page and it's telling you how to do your formatting, the entry you want to be looking for is for journal articles. Even though you've got your journal articles off of the internet, that does not mean that you want to use the internet source format. You want to use the journal article format. You want to make sure that you note where periods go in the reference list, what things need to be in italics. Titles of articles are not in quotation marks unless the authors of the article put something in quotation marks themselves. A lot of students try to put the title of the article in quotation marks, and this is not correct. So another thing in our science writing we want to talk about is limitations, which we've talked about in class before. Any study is going to have limitations or potential problems with the ability to generalize the results to other samples and other populations. So we can talk about, sample size. Was the sample only college students? Were the participants all from one race? What were the participants, or were the participants all from one geographic area? Did the researchers use a survey that might have influenced participants to give incorrect answers to look good or save face? So all of these are potential limitations, and we want to summarize the potential limitations of any source that we write about. And you can do that at the end of the section where you're talking about that article. You can simply write potential limitations of this study include a small sample size and a participant group that was largely more female than male or something like that. Okay, so you can talk about limitations when you finish summarizing each source, and you can also talk about those limitations in your synthesis, which we'll talk about in a second. But you definitely want to talk about them when you finish summarizing a source. So synthesis, what does that mean? Sometimes we think of it as like bringing it all together, comparing and contrasting. We want to do this usually in the last paragraph of our writing. So comparing, so finding similarities, and contrasting, finding differences, are important in demonstrating your understanding of what you're learning. So specifically, you want to demonstrate or point out comparisons and contrasting points. So here's an example. While Bob 2020 and Sue 2019 both studied confirmation bias, Bob's 2020 sample was 220 college students, while Sue 2019 had a larger sample of 3,290 from the general population of San Antonio. So you can see how this is a very specific comparison. They both studied confirmation bias, and a very specific contrast to their information about the sample. Okay. So we've got some typical issues that I see when we're looking at college student papers. And so you want to make sure that you're doing these things correctly. And if you need to Google them to make sure, then make sure you do that. Many students have trouble with the use of apostrophes. Apostrophes are used for ownership. They are not used to make things plural. Make sure that you're doing that correctly. You want to know when you should be using single quotation marks in your writing and when you should be using double quotation marks. If you don't know, or if you are questionable on that, then definitely Google it. Please check your spelling. Use spell check, and then use Grammarly, and then read your work out loud to check for spelling and grammar and writing issues. Redundancy in terms of checking is going to be important because what one program might catch, another program might not catch. You want to make sure that all of your paragraphs start with an indent, so tab in one. A lot of students say, well, I don't want my paper to look like that. That's what a paper looks like, so do it. If a number is starting a sentence, we write it out. So if you're starting off your paper or your sentence, with the sample size, then you have to write that number out in word form. My suggestion, don't start a sample or don't start a sentence with a number, period. Some of the other issues that we find, use the course paper template. I've written it, created it for a reason. Use the outline. I've written it, created it for a reason. Review the sample paper. It's there for a reason. Write in paragraph form. Don't use any bullet points. Don't make lists in your paper. Don't include long quotes. Some students try to make their paper longer so it fits the length requirement by adding in a 350-word quote from one of their papers that they read. Don't do that. First of all, you can only use 3 direct quotes throughout your entire paper, and they have to be less than 10 words long. And second of all, as professors, we know why you're doing that. We generally direct quote for one of 2 reasons. 1, to add space to my paper, or 2, because I have no idea what this paragraph means, but it looks important, so I'm going to include it. Both of those are not good looks. Don't do them. We want to avoid using the word prove in science writing, period. Just don't use it. You may want to say that the results supported a hypothesis. That's fine, but they don't prove a hypothesis. Also, all of your writing should be in the past tense because all the work you're summarizing has already been done. It's already been published. Everything should be in the past tense. Okay, so I hope that this answers the questions that you have about writing. And I know I went quickly, and one of the things about this is that since the video is on YouTube, you can go back and you can pause it and go back through it and take notes and pause it and all that fun stuff. Okay, so if you still have questions about your writing, please feel free to send me a message. But just know that the most problematic challenges that I see in student writing have all been included in this video. So make sure that you watch it, rewatch it, take notes, all that fun stuff. Have fun writing.